The Roman Empire did not fall because its soldiers forgot how to fight. It fell in part because its most experienced soldiers remembered too well. This is not a story about incompetence. It is a story about what happens when institutional memory becomes institutional rigidity, when professional excellence curdles into professional entitlement, and when the very mechanisms designed to preserve stability become engines of its destruction. The Evocati, the Triarii, the Praetorians, the veteran cohorts that represented Rome's military apex, these were not Rome's salvation in its moments of crisis. Increasingly, they became the crisis itself. We speak often of barbarian invasions, of economic collapse, of political decay. But there exists a quieter narrative, one that historians have documented extensively yet rarely centered, the story of how Rome's military professionalism, carried to its logical extreme, produced men who were simultaneously indispensable and unmanageable. Men who had seen too much, endured too much, and been promised too much. Men who knew their own value with a precision that made them dangerous. This is not about singular betrayals or dramatic mutinies, though those occurred. This is about something more insidious, the slow transformation of veteran soldiers from guarantors of Roman power into a separate interest group, one whose priorities increasingly diverged from Rome's own survival. It is about how experience became a liability, how competence became a threat, and how the state that created the world's most effective fighting force eventually found itself held hostage by that very effectiveness. The story begins not with a crisis, but with a success so complete that it contained the seeds of its own unraveling. In 107 BC, Gaius Marius opened military service to the Capitensi, the propertied class whose census designation literally meant counted by head, because they owned nothing else. This was not idealism. It was necessity. Rome's traditional recruitment base, the small farmers who could afford their own equipment, was shrinking. Endless wars had turned those farms into abandoned plots. The choice was simple: evolve or contract. Marius chose evolution. He equipped these propertyless volunteers at state expense, trained them to uniform standards, organized them into cohorts rather than manipular formations, and kept them under arms not for a single campaign season but for 6-year terms that stretched, in practice, to 16 or 20 years. He created, in effect, the first professional standing army in European history since Alexander's Macedonians. The implications were profound and not immediately obvious. These men did not return to farms after each campaign. They had no farms. Their skill was war, and their livelihood depended on practicing it. They became extraordinarily good at their profession because they had no alternative. The Roman legionary of 100 BC was incomparably superior to his predecessor of 200 BC, not because Romans had become braver or stronger, but because they had become specialists. This specialization created veterans of a new type. The old Roman soldier had been a citizen first and warrior second. The Marian legionary was a warrior first, and citizenship became something more abstract, more transactional. His loyalty was not primarily to the Republic's institutions but to the general who recruited him, trained him, fought beside him, and would eventually secure his retirement through land grants and bonuses. This was the original sin, though calling it that implies there was an alternative. There was not. Rome's expansion demanded professional soldiers. Professional soldiers demanded professional compensation. And professional compensation, in a state without an adequate fiscal apparatus, had to come from somewhere other than the treasury. It came from conquest. And from the generals who delivered that conquest. By the 1st century BCE, a pattern had emerged. A successful general would raise legions, promise them rewards, campaign for years in Gaul or Spain or the East, enrich himself and his soldiers through plunder, return to Rome to demand land for his veterans, face resistance from the Senate, threaten or use force, and either succeed in his demands or fail spectacularly. Marius did it. Sulla did it. Pompey did it. Caesar perfected it. Each time, the veterans were the leverage. A general without his veterans was merely a politician. A general with his veterans was a man the Senate had to accommodate or destroy. And destroying a general with battle-hardened legions at his back was not a simple matter, as the Senate learned repeatedly and at great cost. Caesar's veterans are the clearest example. These were men who had spent a decade conquering Gaul, crossing the Rhine, invading Britain. Impossible things that became possible through their discipline and their commander's audacity. They had accumulated wealth, certainly, but more importantly they had accumulated identity. They were Caesar's men. Their status depended on his status. When the Senate moved against Caesar in 49 BCE, it was not just moving against a proconsul with political ambitions. It was moving against 10 legions of men whose entire futures were bound up in Caesar's success. The crossing of the Rubicon was not Caesar's decision alone. It was the culmination of a decade spent building a military force whose interests were inseparable from his own. When he led the 13th Legion into Italy, he was not invading his own country in any meaningful sense. He was securing the pension rights of 60,000 men who had made him wealthy and powerful and who expected, in return, to be made secure. This was the new mathematics of Roman power. Loyalty flowed not from Rome to soldiers through generals, but from generals to soldiers, with Rome as the prize to be captured and distributed. The veterans were not servants of the state. They were stakeholders in a venture, and they expected returns proportional to their investment of blood and years. The civil wars that followed, first between Caesar and Pompey, then between the triumvirs and Caesar's assassins, then between Octavian and Antony, were fought by armies that understood this calculus perfectly. Legionaries changed sides when offered better terms. They mutinied when promises were delayed. They murdered officers who failed to deliver. At Philippi in 42 BCE, at Actium in 31 BCE, the real negotiation was not between commanders but between commanders and their veterans, each side bidding for loyalty with land and gold. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, won these negotiations more consistently than his rivals. He understood that the solution to military usurpation was not to weaken the army but to monopolize it. If every legion's ultimate patron was the emperor, if every veteran's retirement was guaranteed by the imperial treasury through a formal discharge bonus and land allocation system, then generals could not easily turn their armies against the state. They would be managing assets that belonged, in the final analysis, to Caesar. Augustus created the aeraria militare, the military treasury, funded by new taxes specifically designated for veteran bonuses. He regularized discharge procedures, standardizing the 25-year term of service and the payment of either 12,000 sesterces or equivalent land grants upon retirement. He established colonies throughout the empire where veterans could settle, creating communities of retired soldiers who served as stabilizing forces in newly conquered regions while also removing them from the political cauldron of Rome itself. It was brilliant. It was sustainable for as long as the treasury remained full and the conquests continued. And it created a new class of men whose existence was predicated on a system that required, as a precondition of its stability, continuous imperial competence. Veterans now had institutional guarantees rather than personal ones. This was progress. But it also meant that any disruption to those guarantees, any missed payment, any delayed discharge, any failure to maintain the promised benefits, would not be read as one general's failure but as the system's betrayal. And a betrayed professional army is considerably more dangerous than a betrayed personal one, because it has no competing loyalties to moderate its anger. Augustus did not live to see this dynamic fully mature. His successors would. The Praetorian Guard was created, officially, as the emperor's bodyguard. 9 cohorts, initially stationed throughout Italy, eventually concentrated in Rome itself in a massive fortified camp constructed under Tiberius. These were not ordinary soldiers. They served 16-year terms rather than 25. They received 3,750 denarii per year compared to the legionaries' 900. Their discharge bonus was 20,000 sesterces instead of 12,000. They lived in Rome, the center of the world, rather than on some muddy frontier. They were, in every measurable way, the aristocracy of the Roman military. And they knew it. The problem with creating an elite force is that elite forces develop elite consciousness. The Praetorians understood that they were indispensable to imperial survival. No emperor could afford their hostility. This gave them leverage, and they used it with increasing boldness. In 41 CE, after the assassination of Caligula, It was the Praetorians who found Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and declared him emperor. The Senate had been debating a return to the Republic. The Praetorians settled the debate by presenting the Senate with a fait accompli backed by several thousand armed men. They received a generous donative for their efforts, 15,000 sesterces per man, an extraordinary sum that set a dangerous precedent. The message was clear. Emperors were made by the Praetorians, and emperors who wished to remain emperors needed to remember this fact at bonus time. For several decades, the system held. Competent emperors, Claudius, Nero in his early years, Vespasian, Titus, Trajan, Hadrian, managed the Praetorians through a combination of regular pay, occasional bonuses, and the shared understanding that everyone's interests were best served by stability. The Praetorians got their privileges. The emperors got their throne. Rome got internal peace. But privilege, once granted, becomes expectation. Expectation, unmet, becomes grievance. And grievance, in men who carry weapons and guard the palace, becomes regime change. Commodus was murdered in 192 CE by a conspiracy that included Praetorians who had decided he was more trouble than he was worth. His successor, Pertinax, was a respected general and administrator, exactly the sort of competent reformer Rome needed. He lasted 3 months. The Praetorians killed him because he attempted to reimpose discipline and suggested that perhaps they did not need quite so many bonuses. What happened next was unprecedented and somehow inevitable. The Praetorians auctioned the empire. Literally. They announced that the throne would go to the highest bidder. 2 wealthy senators competed, driving the price up in increments until Didius Julius offered 25,000 sesterces per Praetorian, more than a year's salary, more than a discharge bonus. He won the auction. He reigned for 66 days before being executed by order of Septimius Severus, who was marching on Rome with actual legions and who understood that an empire purchased from its bodyguards was not an empire that could long survive. Severus disbanded the Praetorians who had killed Pertinax and auctioned the throne. He replaced them with his own veterans, men from the Danubian legions who had fought for him and who owed their new, luxurious positions entirely to his patronage. This was a solution, but it was also a concession to the deeper problem. The emperor's survival depended on maintaining a force of professional soldiers in Rome who were sufficiently privileged that they had more to lose from chaos than to gain from it. Severus understood this calculus. On his deathbed, according to Cassius Dio, he told his sons, "Enrich the soldiers and scorn all other men." It was cynical, pragmatic, and accurate. The empire's stability rested on the army's satisfaction. Everything else was negotiable. This advice worked for about 1 generation. Then it stopped working, not because emperors stopped following it, but because following it became impossible. The problem was fiscal. The empire's revenue base was relatively fixed. Agricultural production did not increase significantly. Trade routes were stable but not expanding. New conquests after Trajan were rare and unprofitable. Meanwhile, military expenses were rising. More soldiers needed to defend longer frontiers, higher pay required to maintain recruitment, more frequent bonuses demanded by veterans who understood their leverage. The 3rd century CE opened with Caracalla's grant of universal citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. This has been interpreted as progressive, a recognition of common identity. It was also a tax measure. Universal citizenship meant universal liability for the inheritance tax that funded the aerarium militare. Caracalla needed the money because he needed to pay the army because paying the army was the only thing preventing the army from killing him. It did not work. Caracalla was murdered by his Praetorians in 217 CE. His successor, Macrinus, lasted 14 months. The next half-century saw 26 legitimate emperors and countless usurpers, almost all of whom came to power through military acclamation and almost all of whom died violently when another general offered their soldiers better terms. This was not chaos. It was a system functioning according to its internal logic. Emperors were no longer chosen by heredity or competence. They were chosen by the army, specifically by veteran soldiers who knew exactly what they were worth and exactly how to enforce their demands. The problem was that those demands were collectively unsustainable. Every donative promised by a new emperor to secure his throne had to be paid by taxing the same empire that was supposed to be generating prosperity. Every bonus paid to one set of veterans created expectations for every other set of veterans. The frontier legions watched the Praetorians grow wealthy through proximity to power and decided they deserved equivalent treatment. When emperors tried to economize by favoring one military constituency over another, the disfavored group simply proclaimed its own emperor and marched on Rome or on their rivals. The empire fractured into competing military districts, each extracting resources from its territory to pay the soldiers who kept the local commander in power. This is the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. It was not a crisis of external invasion, though those occurred. It was not a crisis of economic collapse, though the economy suffered terribly. It was a crisis of the Roman state's inability to satisfy the demands of its own protectors. Veterans were no longer quietly dangerous. They were loudly, explicitly, ruinously dangerous. And they were dangerous not because they were incompetent or disloyal or barbarous, but because they were competent, understood their leverage, and lived in a system that had trained them to view military service as a transaction rather than a duty. The man who tried to solve this problem was Diocletian. His solution was characteristically Roman. He made the problem larger in order to make it more manageable. Diocletian's reforms were comprehensive, systematic, and logical. He doubled the size of the army to roughly 600,000 men, reasoning that larger forces could better defend the frontiers and that dividing military power among more units would prevent any single general from accumulating enough strength to threaten the throne. He separated military and civil administration, ensuring that governors could not command the troops in their provinces and generals could not command the tax base that fed those troops. He established the tetrarchy, dividing the empire among 4 co-rulers with clear succession mechanisms, preventing the chaos of disputed successions. Most importantly for our purposes, he restructured the military itself into 2 distinct categories, the limitanii and the comitatenses. The limitanii were border troops, stationed permanently along the frontiers, expected to handle local threats with local resources. The comitatenses were mobile field armies, elite forces stationed in the interior, able to respond rapidly to major threats wherever they emerged. This was the formalization of a distinction that had been emerging for a century, between ordinary soldiers who did ordinary garrison work and special soldiers who did important fighting. The limitanii were paid less, received fewer bonuses, and had lower status. The comitatenses were paid more, received generous donatives, and knew they were the regime's indispensable force. The veterans of these field armies were not quietly dangerous. They were openly essential, and they behaved accordingly. Constantine built on Diocletian's system while also transforming it. He established Constantinople as a second imperial capital, creating an eastern power center to balance Rome. He favored the comitatenses even more heavily, expanding their numbers and increasing their privileges. He made Christianity the favored religion, which had unexpected effects on military culture. Christian soldiers still expected to be paid and could still remove emperors, but they now did so with theological justifications attached. What Constantine did not do, because he could not, was solve the fundamental problem. The empire's revenue was inadequate to support the military establishment its security required. The only solution was to extract more from the provinces, but the provinces were already overtaxed. Agricultural productivity was declining in many regions, trade networks were disrupted by endemic warfare, and the monetary system was debased to the point that taxes had to be collected largely in kind rather than coin. Veterans in this environment were caught in a curious bind. They were privileged relative to civilians, but increasingly impoverished relative to their own past. A soldier who retired in 350 CE received his discharge bonus, yes, but that bonus purchased less than it had in 150 CE. The land grants were often in depopulated areas that required substantial investment to become productive. The imperial annona, the grain dole that veterans received, was reliable but minimal. These were men who had spent decades in service, who had fought on the Rhine or the Danube or the Persian frontier, who had survived plague and battle and the routine brutality of military life, and who discovered upon retirement that the state they had defended could not actually afford to keep the promises it had made to them. Their response was not gratitude for what they received. It was anger about what they had been promised and not given. And this anger was shared, multiplied through the communities of veterans who settled together in colonies and who compared their experiences and their grievances. Worse, these veterans maintained connections with active duty soldiers. Brothers, cousins, former tentmates. The social networks of the military were dense and cross-generational. When veterans complained about broken promises, active soldiers listened and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Trust eroded. Loyalty became more explicitly transactional. The pattern repeated across the 4th century. An emperor would come to power, promise generous terms to the army, deliver those terms through extraordinary taxation or debasement, watch the economy contract under the strain, face rebellion from overtaxed provinces or underpaid soldiers, and be replaced by whoever managed the military politics most skillfully in the ensuing chaos. Julian the Apostate tried to restore religious traditionalism and military discipline simultaneously. He was a competent general and a committed reformer. He was also killed in Persia in 363 CE, and his death led to another humiliating peace and another round of donatives to keep the army from fragmenting. Valentinian I was a soldier's emperor, a tough frontier commander who understood military culture intimately. He spent his reign campaigning on the Rhine and Danube, maintaining discipline through personal charisma and regular pay. He also elevated military men to positions throughout the administration, creating a government that understood the army's needs because it was staffed by veterans. He died in 375 CE, and the system he had maintained through force of personality immediately began to fracture. His son Gratian inherited the Western Empire at age 16. Gratian was educated, cultured, and entirely unsuited to managing veteran legionaries who had spent decades following men like his father. He favored Allan cavalry over Roman infantry, promoted intellectual Christians over career soldiers, and generally conveyed the impression that he did not respect the traditional military culture that had sustained the empire. The veterans noticed. When Magnus Maximus, a competent general from Hispania, was proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain in 383 CE, Gratian's own soldiers declined to fight for him with any enthusiasm. He was murdered by one of Maximus's officers while attempting to flee. The message from the army was clear. Emperors who did not respect veterans would not be protected by active soldiers, because active soldiers were simply veterans in waiting. Maximus himself fell to Theodosius I, whose success rested on his ability to recruit and retain Gothic federates, essentially barbarian mercenaries who fought alongside Roman regulars for land and gold. This was a solution to manpower shortages, but it was also an admission that Rome could no longer afford enough Roman veterans to secure its own frontiers. Theodosius was the last emperor to rule both East and West. After his death in 395 CE, the empire divided permanently between his two young sons. The Western Empire, now governed from Ravenna rather than Rome, faced a cascade of interconnected problems: shrinking revenues, contracting recruitment base, barbarian federates who were less culturally Roman and less institutionally loyal, and an army that was simultaneously indispensable and unmanageable. The veteran soldiers of this period were not the confident professionals of the Augustan age or the privileged aristocrats of the Antonine period. They were exhausted, underpaid men watching the empire disintegrate while being blamed for not defending it more effectively. Their sense of betrayal was profound. They had kept their part of the bargain. The state had not. In 408 CE, the Western Field Army mutinied at Ticinum, modern Pavia, over delayed pay. The soldiers killed their commander and several officers. The imperial government, led by the regent Stilicho, negotiated a settlement that included full back pay and additional bonuses. Stilicho himself was executed later that year on suspicion of treason, largely because he had become too powerful through his control of the army. His execution triggered another mutiny, which triggered another purge of officers, which weakened the army's command structure at precisely the moment when Alaric's Goths were marching on Italy. Rome was sacked in 410 CE, the first time in 8 centuries that a foreign enemy had breached its walls. The sack was brief and relatively restrained, Alaric's Goths were Christians who avoided destroying churches, but the psychological impact was immense. Rome was not invincible. The veterans who might have prevented this disaster had been too busy negotiating their pay to effectively resist. This was the bitter arithmetic of the late empire. Veterans were still Rome's most effective soldiers, but they were effective only when paid, and Rome could no longer reliably pay them. When paid inadequately or late, they became bandits, usurpers, or simply passive resistors who declined to fight with any determination. When paid adequately, they consumed resources the empire desperately needed for everything else. There was no solution to this problem within the existing system. The Western Empire in the 5th century was a failing state whose military remained professional, competent, and utterly unaffordable. The fall of the Western Roman Empire has been explained through countless theories: barbarian invasions, economic exhaustion, moral decay, climate change, lead poisoning, Christianity, taxation, plague. All of these played roles. But there is a simpler explanation that incorporates most of these factors. The Western Empire died because it could not pay its veterans and could not survive without them. Consider the fiscal mathematics. A late Roman field army legion numbered roughly 1,000 men, down from the 6,000 of the early empire. The Western Empire in 450 CE fielded perhaps 30 such legions plus auxiliary units, totaling maybe 150,000 soldiers. This sounds manageable. It was not. Each soldier required pay, equipment, food, and the promise of a retirement bonus. The total annual cost of maintaining this force was probably around 40 million solidi, gold coins, roughly equivalent to the entire tax revenue of the western provinces. This meant that every denarius collected in taxes went to military expenses, leaving nothing for administration, infrastructure, or anything else that makes a state functional. Emperors responded by debasing the currency, collecting taxes in kind, and confiscating property from wealthy landowners. These measures generated short-term revenue while destroying long-term productivity. Farmers who could not profit from their land abandoned it. Trade networks collapsed when merchants could not trust the currency. The tax base shrank, which required even more aggressive collection methods, which further shrank the tax base. Veterans caught in this spiral faced impossible choices. The land grants they received upon discharge were often in devastated provinces where barbarian raids had destroyed the agricultural infrastructure. The monetary bonuses they received were paid in debased currency that purchased less each year. The grain rations they were entitled to were delivered irregularly or not at all. A rational veteran, assessing this situation, had several options. He could try to make his assigned land productive, which required capital he probably did not have and security the state could not guarantee. He could join a local strongman, trading his military expertise for protection and patronage. He could become a bandit, using his combat skills to extract from civilians what the state was failing to provide. Or he could re-enlist, accepting whatever terms the army offered because even bad military employment was better than starving on a worthless plot of frontier land. Thousands of veterans made each of these choices. The cumulative effect was the disintegration of civic order in the western provinces. The imperial government could not collect taxes effectively because it could not protect tax collectors. It could not protect tax collectors because it could not afford enough soldiers. It could not afford enough soldiers because it could not collect taxes. The feedback loop was vicious and accelerating. Generals in this environment became warlords. Decius, the last great Roman general of the West, was effectively an independent power broker who maintained his position through Gothic federates who were loyal to him personally rather than to the empire abstractly. He defeated Attila's Huns at the Catalonian plains in 451 CE, a genuine military achievement. He was murdered 3 years later by Emperor Valentinian III, who feared Aetius' power. Valentinian himself was murdered 6 months after that by Aetius' veterans, who did not appreciate seeing their patron killed. This was not politics as usual. This was state collapse rendered in slow motion. The Western Empire in the 450 CE was not a functioning polity. It was a collection of military districts, each controlled by whoever commanded the local armed forces, each extracting what it could from its territory, and each negotiating with barbarian kingdoms that were often more stable and reliable than the imperial government itself. The veterans who should have been defending this empire were instead managing their own survival in an environment where loyalty to Rome purchased nothing of value. When Odoacer, a Germanic general commanding a largely barbarian force, deposed the last Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, the Roman Senate negotiated with him rather than resisting. The Praetorians, to the extent they still existed as an institution, offered no resistance. The veterans of the Italian field armies either joined Odoacer or melted away into the countryside. There was no dramatic final battle. There was no heroic last stand. There was simply the recognition that the Western Empire had become too expensive to maintain and too weak to defend, and that everyone, including the veteran soldiers who were theoretically its defenders, was better off acknowledging this reality and negotiating new arrangements. The Eastern Empire survived for another 1,000 years, but it survived in part by learning from the West's failure. Eastern emperors maintained smaller, more affordable armies. They paid those armies reliably by taxing a wealthier, more urbanized economic base. They used diplomacy and bribery to manage barbarian threats rather than trying to defeat them militarily. And they never allowed veterans to accumulate the political leverage that Western veterans had wielded. The Eastern Empire was still destroyed by its own army. Eventually, the Praetorian factions of Constantinople murdered emperors and installed usurpers throughout the medieval period. But it was destroyed slowly over centuries, rather than quickly over decades. The difference was that Eastern emperors never completely lost control of military finances. They could pay their veterans. Therefore they could survive. The historical record is clear about what happened. The Western Roman Empire collapsed because it could not afford the military force necessary to defend itself, and it could not afford that force because its veterans demanded compensation that exceeded the state's fiscal capacity. The veterans were not irrational to make these demands. They had been promised security in exchange for service. The state failed to deliver. They responded accordingly. But this narrative, however accurate, leaves a deeper question unresolved. Why did Rome's leaders allow this situation to develop? They were not stupid. They were not ignorant of history. They could see that excessive military expenditure was bankrupting the state. Why did they not reduce the army to an affordable size, even if that meant surrendering frontier provinces? The answer is that they tried. Multiple emperors attempted to economize, to streamline, to negotiate away expensive commitments. Every attempt failed because the soldiers who would be affected by these economies had the power to prevent them. An emperor who disbanded veteran legions would be removed by those legions. An emperor who reduced military pay would be killed by soldiers who felt betrayed. The political calculus was brutal. Short-term survival required satisfying military demands, even if those demands made long-term survival impossible. This was a trap without exit. Every emperor faced the same choice: pay the veterans and bankrupt the state, or refuse to pay the veterans and be replaced by someone who would. Rational analysis suggested that the empire needed to contract, to abandon Britain and much of Gaul and the Danubian provinces, to fortify Italy and Africa and the wealthiest eastern territories and accept the loss of the rest. But accepting that loss required accepting the hatred of every soldier who had fought to conquer and defend those provinces, every veteran who had been promised land there, every family who had built its future on the assumption of continued imperial expansion. Rome's leaders chose slow collapse over radical surgery because radical surgery would have killed the patient immediately. The veterans would not have permitted any emperor to surrender the empire they had built. So emperors continued to promise what could not be delivered, to tax what could not bear the burden, to debase currency until it meant nothing, and to hope that somehow the situation would stabilize. It never did. The Western Empire died not because its leaders made irrational decisions but because every rational decision available to them was unacceptable to the soldiers they depended on for survival. The veterans were Rome's most experienced military force. They were also the group with the most to lose from rational reform. Their experience, their competence, their very indispensability made them the obstacle that Rome could not overcome. This is the quiet danger that the documentary's title references. Not the danger of incompetent soldiers or barbarous mercenaries, but the danger of professional excellence that has calcified into institutional capture. The veterans knew exactly what they were worth. They knew exactly what had been promised to them. They knew exactly how to enforce their demands. And because they were right, because they had been promised these things, because they had earned them through decades of brutal service, there was no moral argument that could convince them to accept less. A modern observer might suggest that Rome should have transitioned to a smaller, more professional force supplemented by militia and local defense forces. This is what the Eastern Empire eventually did. But making that transition required surviving the transition period, when the existing veterans would resist every step of the process. The Western Empire did not have the institutional strength, the fiscal reserves, or the political legitimacy to survive that resistance. There is an economic concept called the sunk cost fallacy, the idea that past investments, being unrecoverable, should not influence present decisions. Rome's veterans represented an enormous sunk cost. The empire had invested centuries of resources into creating them, training them, employing them. The rational response to fiscal crisis would have been to write off that investment and start fresh. But the veterans were not sunk costs on a balance sheet. They were armed men with families and histories and expectations, and they had the power to veto any decision that did not account for their interests. The Western Empire fell because it was captured by its own success. The military system that had conquered the Mediterranean world had, through its very effectiveness, created a class of men whose continued satisfaction was necessary for imperial survival. When the empire could no longer afford that satisfaction, it did not reform. It disintegrated. This pattern is not unique to Rome. Every state that relies on professional soldiers eventually faces the question of what happens when those soldiers' interests diverge from the state's interests. Usually the soldiers win, not because they are more numerous or more powerful, but because they are more organized and have clearer objectives. A state's purpose is diffuse, contested, and abstract. A veteran's purpose is concrete: secure my pension, honor your promises, ensure my family's future. Rome's veterans were quietly dangerous not because they were secretly plotting against the empire, but because they were openly insisting on promises the empire could not keep. They were dangerous not through treachery but through legitimacy. They had been told that service would be rewarded with security. They had served. They demanded the reward. The empire died trying to pay a debt it had incurred during its rise. The question that remains unresolved is whether this was inevitable. Was there a moment when reform was possible, when the political will and fiscal capacity existed to restructure the military system before it consumed the state? Was there a leader who could have convinced the veterans to accept less for the sake of the empire's survival? The historical record suggests not. Every emperor who tried to reduce military expenditure either failed or was removed. The veterans' power was too great, their claims too legitimate, their organization too effective. They were not a mob that could be dispersed or a conspiracy that could be detected. They were the infrastructure of Roman power, and when that infrastructure demanded payment, the empire had no choice but to pay or collapse. So it paid and paid and paid, until there was nothing left to pay with. And then it collapsed anyway, not suddenly but gradually, as soldiers who had not been paid found other employment and provinces that had not been defended accepted new rulers and systems that had not been maintained simply stopped functioning. The Western Roman Empire ended not with a bang but with a bureaucratic memo. In 476 Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus and sent a letter to the Eastern Emperor Zeno. The letter stated, essentially, that the Western provinces no longer required a separate emperor and would be content with nominal Eastern oversight while Odoacer administered Italy on Zeno's behalf. Zeno accepted this arrangement because he had no capacity to enforce anything else. The veterans of Rome, those quiet and dangerous men who had built an empire, were not present at this ending. They had already moved on, finding employment with Gothic kings or becoming landowners or simply fading into historical obscurity. Their legacy was an empire that had extended from Britain to Mesopotamia and had endured for half a millennium. Their tragedy was that the system which made them necessary also made them impossible, and Rome discovered too late that it could neither afford its protectors nor survive without them. This is the story that historians document but rarely center, Not the story of how Rome fell to barbarians, but the story of how Rome died trying to pay the men who had made it great. It is a story without villains, which makes it more disturbing than a simple narrative of corruption or incompetence. Everyone involved made rational decisions based on their interests and information. The soldiers who demanded payment were not wrong. They had been promised it. The emperors who paid them were not wrong. Refusing would have meant immediate overthrow. The civilians who could not bear the tax burden were not wrong. The burden was genuinely unbearable. And yet the cumulative effect of these rational decisions was civilizational collapse. This is the unresolved question. How does a society escape a trap where every individual's rational choice leads to collective disaster? Rome never found the answer. The veterans remained quietly dangerous until the end, and the empire that had made them powerful discovered that power, once distributed, cannot be easily reclaimed.